Nothing to see, move along, move along. Here we are. We spare no expense to bring you the best tourist sites in the city of Melbourne. This is the Queen Victoria Market. I'm standing on the bodies of 7,500 people. The history of the Queen Victoria Market is quite interesting. The first cemetery of the fledgling colony was sited here in 1842, and in 1876 the cemetery was extended right across to the main road. So now the contractor, who was given the job of removing the bodies from here to the Pioneer Cemetery in Faulkner in Melbourne, the Faulkner Cemetery, was a really smart contractor. Not that much has changed over the years with developers and contractors. In the contract it said that he needed to remove the bodies where there were headstones. As most early Victorians were very poor, only 10% had headstones, so 10% of the bodies were removed, the headstones were removed, and the rest of the people were actually left interned. Now, we think of the bodies of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner are buried across in that direction. But since 1872, this has been a market. It's now more of a tourist site than a market. It's going to be redeveloped in a nice way, they tell us. It's going to struggle over a decade regarding redevelopment, but I'm not here for that. But just to give you a background of the site we're on, we're actually standing on thousands of bodies. I mean, this is the nature. Remember, the first European colonialists that came into Victoria came on the ship, the Free Enterprise, from Tasmania to murder and exploit and dispossess the local inhabitants. And I think the fact that 40 years later, 50 years later, that they turned the cemetery into a market says a lot for the type of society this was. But what I want to talk about is child poverty today. Now, few things disgust me these days, few things disgust me. You get surprised, but I do get surprised about living in Australia. We've got a population of 25 million people living in a wonderful continent which we've taken away from the original inhabitants without giving them any compensation. And we've got some of the best mineral resources in the world which we exploit. We've got agricultural land which we exploit, and it's a rich country. I mean, this isn't Bangladesh with 150 million people living on a floodplain. This is a 25 million people living on a continent. Now, you would imagine in a country where you can buy anything, if you look behind me, you can actually see the city, a huge mega metropolis, one of the great 50 cities of the world. You would think in a country like this that we wouldn't have poverty, let alone child poverty. And what disgusts me about the situation is the fact that most people shrug their shoulders and say, that's the way it is. And people in authority say, nothing to see, move along. Now, the Child Protection Commissioner, the Federal Child Protection Commissioner, has given out a report today, which is the 25th of November 2019, a report which should be front page news, which should be the lead item in every news, radio and television news item, which should be on conversation on everybody's lips. Of the 5.5 million children under the age of 18 in this country, 1 in 6, almost a million, are living in poverty. I'll repeat that again. In the land of opportunity, the land of milk and honey, 1 million children are living below the poverty line. And just to give you an example of how desperate things are, 20% of parents of these children told the Human Rights Commissioner, the Children's Human Rights Commissioner, that they couldn't even afford medicines for their children, despite having concession cards and despite theoretically being able to access medical care through Medicare. Because what we've seen over the last 20 years is a slow destruction of the universal health system, but that's another topic I'll talk about another day. So here we have a country where in 1990 Mr Bob Hawke, the late Prime Minister, said no child will be living in poverty in Australia. in 1990. We don't need child poverty. We don't have to have child poverty. We are a rich country. We have billionaires in this country. We have corporate, multinational and transnational corporations which are not paying tax and making billions of dollars of profit. We have local resources which have been given away to corporations, both locally owned and overseas owned, for a peppercorn rent. Whereas we have a system, we have institutional structures which reward people with disposable income. We have billions of dollars being pumped into the private education system and the private health insurance industry and into corporate welfare in this country. We have billions of dollars available. But 1 in 6 children live in poverty in this country. I'm talking about grinding, day-to-day poverty where their parents don't know where the next meal is coming from, how they're going to pay the next electricity bill. And this should not be happening. These are handicaps which children aren't born with, but they are created. Federal government policy, state government policy, community expectations that will always have children living in poverty. That poverty is part and parcel of a capitalist system. Now, poverty does not have to be part and parcel of the capitalist system. If you look at the situation in Norway, and I'm talking about bloody revolution, they've got $1 trillion in a state fund. And how do they get $1 trillion with a population of 4.5 million? They got that $1 trillion by owning their own assets, resources, and actually putting the profits into a national fund to assist the people of that country. We don't need to have one child living in poverty. If we had the services allocated, we don't even need to have children, being taken away from their parents in the majority of cases with support. If we had a universal basic income, no child would need to be living in poverty. And this is the situation we have today. And the tragedy is not the fact that 1 in 6 Australian children are living in poverty, but the tragedy is that most Australians will shrug their shoulders and move on. It is not an issue. It is not a news item. If it doesn't affect them, it doesn't matter. And the other tragedy is that as far as the government is concerned at all levels, state, local and federal, they just say, nothing to see, move on, nothing to see. All right? Nothing to see. So we have created this situation, and this situation continues to exist because we do two things. We either internalise our own angst, and what we've seen in Australia over the last 2 decades as an internalisation of this constant anxiety we're under. We feel in order to perform, and we need to work in low-paid, miserable jobs in order to survive. So you get this. So no wonder the fish, that's right, the fish in Australia's waterways are complaining about the amount of antidepressants in the sewage effluent and the water in Australian society. We have become a nation of people who are racked by anxiety because we internalise these problems. So if you're poor, you think, well, I'm poor because it's my fault. I'm poor and I can't look after my kids because it's my fault. People don't look beyond the fact that they are part of a wider society. And that's as radical activists, that's our job, is to point out to people, fine, we all have individual failings, and I have more than most, but we are part of a community. And if you've got a community which is based on one principle, and Australian society is based on one principle, and that is the maximisation of private profits for corporations, irrespective of the human, social, environmental and national costs. That's why the election was lost, because all these shareholders out there didn't want to give up their franking credits. This is what Australia has become. It's become a country that no longer has a philosophy that guides it, that we are here to look after our interests and the interests of those around us, not just our interests. The whole culture has changed. We've gone from a fair go society or fair go mate to a you'll be right type of society. The thing is, we won't be right. And if we look at the children and the type of problems they're facing, and we look at the adults and look at the type of problems we're facing, all levels of society, all financial levels of society, we begin to see there is something structurally, inherently wrong with organising society on the basis of maximising profits, irrespective of the human, social, environmental and national costs. And our children, those 1 in 6 children living in poverty, are the canaries who are telling us that there is something horribly wrong with society as rich as Australia, with as few people as Australia, 25 million living on a continent, that cannot address this issue. And this is what we have. We have this ability as a nation to deny reality. And that's what the very essence of our creation as a nation was. The ability to deny the reality that we invaded this land, colonised this land, dispossessed the original inhabitants in the most brutal fashion. We have forgotten that everything we enjoy today in terms of rights and privileges are not rights and privileges which are incorporated in the Australian Constitution, because there are no rights and privileges in the Australian Constitution, but they're rights and privileges millions of Australians have fought for, and in many cases died for, and in many cases suffered for, in order for us to enjoy the standard of living that we now enjoy. We have forgotten our history. We are a country with no history. We are a country, if you've got no history, if you've got no past, you have no future. All you have is the present. And what we see is a country and a population that is basically divided on what I describe as irrelevant lines, divided on the basis of a culture, divided on the basis of the way they speak, divided on the basis of where they live in Australia, divided on the basis of a person's skin, their sexual orientation. So we've got all these wars occurring in society, all these brushfires across Australian society, merging together into a huge bushfire. And at the same time, we are ignoring the major issues which confront us. And child poverty is one of those major issues. And especially if it's institutionalised child poverty, where there is no mechanism by which parents or caregivers or the children themselves can scramble out of that pit. All we are doing is creating more child poverty, more dysfunction, more people in prison, more crime, more dislocation, more anxiety as a community. And for these figures to jump up on air for a few minutes and then disappear out of our consciousness is part of the problem that we face as a community. We deny the past, we live for the present, and we have no plans for the future. No society can deny its past. It needs to recognise its past, make amends if it needs to make amends, look at its present and use the present to shape the future. But we are not using the present to shape the future. We are not looking at the markers that we see on a day-to-day basis, like the markers regarding child poverty, markers regarding inequality, markers regarding social isolation, markers regarding increasing anxiety and depression in the community, markers regarding increasing indebtedness. I mean, Melbourne is the most indebted city part of Australia. Our debts are twice our income on average. Could you imagine that? Debts twice of income. You cannot continue. So we ignore the present and we destroy what future we have. And nothing highlights this more than the attitude to the climate change which is merging into a climate emergency. If we can deny the fact that we are on the brink of a catastrophe, if we continue the way we go without making major economic and social and cultural and personal changes, we can deny anything and we can tolerate child poverty. Think about it. As I keep saying, the ball is in your court. Child poverty does not need to exist. Every child should have the same opportunities as every other child. While the federal government and state government continues to subsidise the children of the rich by subsidising private schools at the expense of the children of working people and the poor, we will continue to have child poverty in this country. It should be at the top of one of the top 3 issues that we need to tackle as a community. Climate emergency, our relationship with the Indigenous population, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and child poverty in this country. Thank you for listening. Next week we'll find another fascinating place for you. And the great thing is you can hear the bird. Here we are in the Queen Victoria Markets, the centre of the city. Concrete, tarmac, bodies beneath our feet, and I can hear the chirping of a bird, as well as the roaring of trucks, the passage of trams, you name it. At least the sun's shining today. All the best. See you next week.